we thank you for that, Zahra. Like your commitment to amplifying Palestinian voices around the world is is phenomenal. Like really, thank you for that. So
Thank you.
obviously your book, we mentioned that your book comes out in 2027, the third one. Um,
Yes.
what are you willing to to share about that book? Unless it's a
Yeah, I can't talk too much about it because it's premature,
yeah.
but I will tell you that it is going to be a collection of essays by journalists, by Palestinian journalists in Gaza, the West Bank. We have one from Haifa,
Hmm.
so from 48 as well. Um, and they are going to be writing similarly to how our women in the ground, the journalists in that book, were writing about their personal experiences covering war and socioeconomic upheaval, and how their journalism often intertwined with their personal lives and experiences. And of course, that is going to be the same for the journalists in Palestine. I think the difference here is that it's going to be women and men. That was very important for
Hmm.
me.
Hmm.
I think we often see the dehumanization or erasure of Palestinian men when we talk about the tragedies.
Hmm.
Yeah.
We talk about women and children, and of course we should, but also there are men who are being murdered in the scores, the tens of thousands too, and we need to sort of humanize them as well. That's part of the work that we do, because they have been dehumanized so much. So for me, it was really important to include men in this story, in this collection of essays as well. I already have two or three that have come in that are just just incredible. So eye-opening, moving, harrowing. And I'm working closely with journalists on the ground in Gaza there too. They're still there. Of course, there's a lot of trauma involved with that. There's a lot of sensitivity that I have to keep in mind as an editor. There's a lot of trust building
Hmm.
involved. But this is the most important work I've ever done in my life. I feel like everything has built up to this book for me. And it is a true honor and a true privilege for these journalists to invite me into their lives in the way that they have.
Yeah.
And yeah, some of it is sort of me exchanging multiple voice notes with people who don't have the emotional bandwidth to start writing themselves. So I'm sort of compiling their stories and helping them shape their stories through voice notes. So I have hours and hours of voice notes from Gaza, from some incredible journalists there. So those are sort of the beginnings of the work. I've only just really finalized the list of journalists. So far, I think we're going to be about 12 to 13 essays,
Mhm.
but with anthologies, and of course, in the midst of a genocide, things are subject to change. I think also important to note that most of the journalists will be writing in Arabic for this book,
Hmm.
whereas
Mhm.
most of the journalists for Our Women on the Ground were writing in
Hmm.
English. So we're going to have a Palestinian translator, Hazem Jamjoom, who's incredible London-based Palestinian translator who will be translating the essays. And there's a certain lyricism to Arabic, and the translation into English I think it's going to feel different this time around because of that. But I'm actually quite excited because I wanted to make sure that these are local voices and these are people who might not otherwise be
Hmm.
heard. They're not necessarily journalists who have the huge platforms. So that's just some of what I can tell you. Can't really delve much more
Hmm.
into it, especially because it's early days. Yeah.
Hmm. Wow.
Fair. Yes.
We've tried reaching out to journalists in Gaza before, and it's just so difficult because they're going through so much, and their internet connection is weak, and there's just so many struggles trying to, share their stories. And so I'm really amazed that you're doing this, Zahra, because they're trying to erase Palestinian journalists, and what you're doing is memorializing them forever by having their voices in a book. I think that is so
Yes, the
important.
title for me was very important. Yeah, so Let It Be a
Mm-hmm.
Tale is the last line in Rifat Al-Harir's
Mm-hmm.
poem. Um, and I really wanted to honor him But also it's this idea of carrying over and carrying forward. If I must die, let it be a tale.
Mhm.
And Musab Abu Toha is going to be writing the foreword, which was incredibly just so meaningful to me that he agreed to it. But also the subtitle of it is Palestinian Journalists on Survival and Resistance. So their journalism as a form of resistance was also very important to incorporate. And those themes are certainly coming through in the book so far in the essays that I've seen.
Wow. And so you're Lebanese. You have Egyptian and Palestinian descent. You've lived in Lebanon. You live in the
Yes.
UK. You've lived in the USA. Why do you care so much about these topics, and that you've decided to put your career into writing articles for different news websites, and then also writing books on all these topics? Um, and you've been doing this for a while now too. So how have you
Yeah.
maintained so consistent on this topic?
I think I've always been drawn to Arab culture. Um, as someone who was born in the West, I mean, my parents left Lebanon during the Civil War, so we were born there. And as a young girl, I was always drawn to my identity, who I was, because I knew obviously it's that sort of age-old story of like being in the diaspora and not knowing where you fit in and trying to figure out who you are, all that kind of thing. And coming of age, for me, my anchor was always being Arab and the knowledge that I was Arab. And this was because my mother and father instilled that in us growing up. When we were kids, we were listening to Fairuz, we were hearing stories about our region of origin, about our culture. And also I was consuming journalism there as a child, like trying to understand like what's happening in my home. I was young, but my parents always had the TV on because they wanted to keep up with what was happening back home. And that,
Ah,
obviously I know, very typical because they just like desperately wanted to cover the news,
mhm.
to watch the
You're like
news.
Said
And
that
then,
way. Said used to be. Said grew
yeah,
up watching the news. I did not grow up watching the news, and so now
that's
I'm learning
funny.
about all the
That's interesting.
things and trying to put into context. Oh, when I was a kid, what was going on in Sierra? All of a sudden, we just had Syrian classmates come in. I didn't realize what was going on. And so
Yeah,
now being older
yeah,
and
it's really
mature and
interesting.
learning, it's such it puts things into context. How being connected
Absolutely.
to the news when
Yeah,
you're
so
younger.
I think
Mhm,
yeah, it was that connection, and I think, as far as sort of the Palestinian connection was that my grandmother, who was of Egyptian
mhm,
ancestry, and my grandfather, who was of Lebanese ancestry, they were naturalized Palestinians in Haifa in 1948. They were exiled from Haifa in the Battle of Haifa as part of the Nakba. So they moved to Lebanon as refugees, were registered as Palestinian refugees. And there's always this story in the family. It's it's a pain point. It was like the entire history of the family was rewritten with their exile in 48 to Lebanon. And always that longing of return to
mhm.
Palestine and having that
Yeah.
land and having that home and not knowing what became of the land and the home is something we grew up with. We were aware that this was part of our family story. My grandfather used to كان يبيع فول وحمص, used to sell hummus and fool, fava bean
Mm.
stew, in Palestine off of the back of a donkey.
Mhm,
That was his first job. He used to travel along the outskirts of Haifa with pots of toom and sorry, of fool and
mm,
hummus, and he used to sell them. And then eventually opened his own fool shop in Haifa. And I actually wrote a story about that, about his legacy as the king of fool. But again,
mhm.
Palestine was always part of that story, of that family story. And then he ended up opening a fool shop in Saida after, having to rebuild his entire life there and the lives of the family. My grandmother was actually pregnant with my father in 1948 when she was
Wow.
exiled, when she made that trip from Haifa to Saida. So,
Wow.
and I'm sure many of your listeners know there was a lot of trade and movement. They used to call Haifa the Little
Mm.
America, before, of course, everything changed.
It's an interesting little fact.
And yeah, and
Because it used to be a
it
training
was just a
ground.
part of
Sorry, just to follow up on the Little
Yeah, yeah.
America. Why do they call it Little
Well, there used to be a train,
America?
there was a lot of
Oh wow,
movement between the areas. Yeah, and my grandfather moved there as a young child. Um, so there was this idea, I think there was a lot of movement, between Lebanon and Palestine. Obviously,
Hmm.
you're talking about, just hours you could get from one
yeah,
place to
most
the
definitely.
other.
Hmm.
Yeah, so we do have that those roots, those roots in Palestine, and it's
Yeah.
something that I've always been aware of and always wanted to explore and have always wanted to go to Haifa. And there's like a missing piece in the family, you know? We have the land papers, but we don't know what became of the home and the land. And my father is now in his 70s. He's as old as the Nakba, you
Wow.
know,
Yeah.
because he was born in that year in October 1948. And it's kind of like that missing piece in the family story and the family history.
Have you guys heard any,
So yeah,
have you heard any news or like any information maybe from neighbors who used to live there or about what happened
yes,
to the land?
actually the Palestinian journalist Vera Sajrawi was actually trying to help me with this. Things got, of course, quite difficult after October 7, but she was trying to help me with this. We suspect probably that the building was actually destroyed
Mm. Yeah.
in that year because it was on the outskirts of Haifa in Balad al-Sheikh, so it was probably destroyed, but we don't know for sure. But I'm still looking into it, and it's still something. It's still a trip I would hope that I can make at some point.
Hmm.
Not feeling very likely right now, but again, it's something my father in his last wishes and his these years of his as he's aging. It's one of his wishes for me to go there.
Mm.
So again, this is just part of the family story. I feel very much, very connected to the Levant. And it comes through, I know, in my work, and it's something that it's never going to stop as far as my career. I think I'm always going to be drawn to writing about what I can about the region, not just the tragedy and the trauma, but also the culture and the joy.
Hmm. And do you still
Wow.
feel like that you can't place yourself now that you live in New York and you've also lived in the UK at some point, m- moving around
Mm.
constantly? Does that feeling follow you?
It does. I think about it a lot, what is home, where is home? Right now, I live in New York and I'm very happy in New York. I have my community here.
Hmm.
Of course, I've lived in the UK, I've lived in Dubai, I've lived in a number of different places, but I feel very strongly that I belong in the Levant, in Lebanon. That's where my mother is, that's where my father is. I feel that strong emotional attachment. However, we bring pieces of our identity with us wherever we go, so I can create my own little Lebanon here to the best of my
Hmm.
ability. I try, we have our community, right? We
Most
have
definitely.
we have our there's so many of us in the diaspora,
Yeah.
as we know. There are Lebanese everywhere. There's you'll always find a Lebanese person, you always find, Palestinians and Egyptians, and to me that's how I kind of create my own little home, little bits of
Hmm.
home are my community wherever I am. Of course, there's nothing like going back home, going back to Saida and having a
Mm.
manouche,
Oh,
Yeah, I know.
or having food for breakfast, there's nothing quite like
full
Hmm.
that.
mtabbal.
But
What's
yeah,
like
there's
Lebanon? Yeah.
certainly a feeling of being dispersed. Yeah, exactly. There's certainly a feeling of being dispersed, and I'm sure that you can relate to that.
You know, I I hope to see you in Lebanon one day too, and hope to see you in Palestine one day even sooner. Hopefully, I had this wild dream last night. I know because if I was preparing for this, but
Hmm.
I dreamt that all the Palestinians in Lebanon just got up and walked across the border and just went to northern Palestine and just that's it. And that was the end of it. And then just lived their happy life. I don't know how realistic that is. It's a crazy dream, but
That's quite that's quite a dream. It's quite a dream. Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
quite a dream.
It's a tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tragedy what we're witnessing. It is a true tragedy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I've been reading a lot of Gibran Khalil Gibran recently as well, and um, his point of view on this is that, oh, we come from the Levant, we explore the world, we get new ideas, we develop ourselves, and then bring that piece back home with us so that we can make our home even better. Do you have that perspective?
Yeah. I haven't read Gibran in a
Oh,
while. That's lovely.
yeah, no, he's brilliant. Yes, so I know.
Yeah.
Do you have that perspective on it? Yeah,
Yeah, I think so.
because you're doing important work.
I don't know where
Hmm.
home ultimately will
Hmm.
be, you know. I don't know where home ultimately will be. But of course, I think a lot of Lebanese have started to feel like they're living in exile as well, you know, that it wasn't just that we emigrated, so to speak. It's that the situation there has been so difficult since 2019 as well. And there was often always for me this, and I've written about it,
Hmm.
there was always a desire return. And there was always an idea that this was temporary, that I would come and I would make money and I would send money back home. And then eventually I would repeat what my parents had done. You know, my parents had done this. My parents had left Lebanon in the, early 80s and they spent some time abroad and then they returned to Lebanon. And there was always that feeling that maybe I would do the same. And that was always my desire and my goal. But unfortunately, over the years, that had changed as the situation in Lebanon deteriorated. I know there's some hope now, even though the war was incredibly devastating. I know that some people are feeling some hope now for a future in Lebanon that will look different. Perhaps I'm not as hopeful as others, or maybe I'm cautiously optimistic or skeptical. But yeah, there's always this idea of just not being sure,
Hmm.
really, ultimately where home is.
Hmm. And
Yeah.
it's something when you learn so much about the world too. Sometimes it does feel very hopeless. Like when you learn about all the injustices going on all around the world to so many people and all these power
Of
struggles,
course,
it makes you
yes.
feel like you have no control, But I hate that feeling of helplessness. I like to believe that we have the power to make change um, in our own destinies in the future, and we get to shape our own worlds the way we want to do it. It's hard, like like making a sculpture or something, right? That's difficult. You have to chip at the stone, but it's gonna take some time. But I think we can do it. That's how I like to see it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also value in looking at what other communities have done, marginalized communities, looking at how they have
Hmm.
been, how they have resisted. I don't like the word resilience; it's very charged,
Hmm.
but and allyship and solidarity with those communities as well, especially as they have really stood with us, stood with Palestinians and Lebanese, since October 7. And I think there's a lot of value in that, and I've found a lot of, I think, solace and community in that, being here in New York City and seeing that is positive. It feels that we do have that backing, we do have that support.
That's true.
That has been really meaningful. And just looking at the encampments too, I mean,
Hmm.
all of the students who've been speaking up for Palestine, they've been across different communities from the global south, or minority communities, black and brown communities, and that is, I think there's a lot of value in that.
Most definitely. And those people are so brave. Some of the bravest people because they're putting their degrees, their money on the line, their citizenship, going to
Absolutely.
jail, everything on the line, and police brutality, all those kinds of experiences, getting doxxed, everything like that. So it's so challenging what
Yeah,
they're going through, but they're so brave to put themselves out there like that. You know,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, amazing, amazing work. Commend to everyone out there doing
Um,
that. Side.
yeah, I had a question. Zahra, you mentioned that resilience is an overcharged term. Can I ask you for you to elaborate why?
I think often, and I think, it's not just amongst Arabs or Arab communities, it's especially amongst other minority communities, is there's this idea that, oh, we're so resilient, we can take it, we can get up and, figure things out and mobilize and be resourceful and be sort of willing to overcome the difficulties that are thrown our way. I think that there's some exhaustion and fatigue when it comes to that, where we shouldn't have to be resilient. We shouldn't have to fall back on this concept or notion of resilience in the first place.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where some of the criticism of the word or the notion of it comes in, because there is this like focus on, oh, but look, they're able to sort of get up and do their thing, or let's celebrate the refugee who became an Olympian swimmer, or the person living in exile who was able to become a CEO, or there's this idea of like, oh, well, they can do it kind of thing. But actually, the root of that resilience is a lot of trauma.
Mhm.
And I think that's where the criticism of the word comes in, or the Lebanese being fed up of being so resilient time
Yeah.
and time again, you know. I feel like the Lebanese will criticize everything, though. I mean, it's just very, it's very, very Lebanese. But I think it's a fair critique, and I do
Mm.
see it across cultures and communities. It's not limited to us, of course.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It does normalize for people in the Middle East, especially like I can relate to the point about the Lebanese people having to go through this all the time, and it's kind of
Yeah,
as if they're held to the standard that yeah, you should be okay with just having so much trauma in your life. It's fine. You should. This is normal
yeah,
thing.
like people before you had it and they were okay,
Yeah,
and you'll be okay. Yeah,
and that
yeah,
your family also kind of like reinforces that because they've also gone through so much trauma themselves. Like
yeah. It's kind of in culture a little bit too, like shit halak, like
exactly.
it's fine. But then, of course, we also know that we have a huge mental health crisis
Yeah,
all over the Middle East and the Arab world, or Swana, however you want to refer to it.
What is
Um,
this, Swana?
and
Swana? What is
yeah,
that?
yes, Southwest Asia, North Africa region.
Okay.
It's kind of a phrase that, yeah, to replace quote unquote the Middle
Okay, I've
East.
heard Mina before.
It's like it's
Yeah.
kind of a colonial phrase. It's a decolonial phrase, so to
Okay.
speak.
Gotcha. Instead of the Middle East.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Hmm.
Okay, can I ask you about that word choices? So you write articles for CNN, for Teen Vogue. We've read some of them. What
Hmm.
what when you're writing an article about, let's say, Palestine or something like that, what are the constrictions? I don't know if that's the word, constraints on your language you're allowed to use um, when writing for these articles. Does that make sense for a question?
It depends. It does, of course. Every single media outlet and
Hmm.
publication has a strict set of
Hmm.
guidelines and standards in terms of words and phrases that can be used. Now, we know, of course, it's not a secret that when it comes to Palestine, certain phrases and terminologies are considered particularly contentious. Even if a human rights organization, multiple human rights organization, has referred to what's happening in Gaza as a genocide, you're not going to see the use of that word stated as fact in specific media outlets. I mean, you will see it in Al Jazeera,
Hmm.
of course, or Middle East Eye, or certain Arab publications. And I think that's just a given. I think people are aware of this. I think
hmm
there are attempts to kind of shape things or mold things or agitate things from the inside, especially from Arabs and
yeah,
allies who work within these institutions. However, I think we do know that there are constraints, and in my work, in my writing, I use the language or the wording that aligns with my values. However, sometimes you may have different editors or different
Hmm.
publications that may change the or ask that certain things be, and that's just part of engaging with Western media and certain institutions. And I'm aware of those nuances, of course. The most important thing for me is to be professional in my work, which I aspire to do and constantly am. As a journalist who, was sort of taught journalistic ethics, there is also a discussion around positionality and, where does a person stand? What does it mean to be a journalist? Are you quote unquote neutral as a journalist? Do you not bring with you your own
Mm.
background and your own quote unquote biases and all of that kind of thing? I think, there's definitely some value in recognizing that every media institution has its own biases.
Mhm. Yeah.
And people, who work within those institutions also have their own biases. It's almost impossible to approach these kinds of subjects by divorcing them completely from a person's identity.
Yeah, that's true.
That is where I stand, and I feel like positionality is actually quite important in sort of making it known. If you do prefer to use certain phrases or and at the end of the day, a lot of people, of course, may decide not to publish with certain publications or work with certain publications or institutions, and I also understand that it's sort of, I think, a difficult moment in journalism when it comes to that kind of thing. If you are an Arab, these are questions that you have to ask yourself when you are writing and engaging with these institutions.
Mm.
Well put.
They don't ever send you like a list of words that you can't and can't use. It's usually just some guy called Josh in the editing room changing the words that you.
No, I've personally not received such a, but I think internally, I mean, it is, I mean, jokes aside, internally, these guidelines do certainly
Yeah.
exist for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of these the guidelines are also public. Like, you can find, um, you know, certain style. They're, often they're called style guides or
Hmm.
editorial guides, and some of them can be public as well, or they end up leaking to the public, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
Yeah. Um, okay, so tell us a bit more about. Sai, do you have any other questions on this before we pivot? Cool.
Mhm. I'd like to Yes, go ahead, Ali.
Talk about women versus male journalists. You work with a lot of female journalists. Um, what is but in the context of Gaza, you were talking about, oh, it's important to include more male journalists as well, since we don't hear their voices, or male journalists are being treated as if they're violent or something like that, or they're not a human being even. So, um, can you share your experience of working with female journalists for your first book, um, especially in the Middle East, because women get silenced quite a bit in the Middle East, from my knowledge and experience. Would you say so?
Yeah, I mean, and it depends on where we're talking about. It's such a vast region, and each country has its own set of challenges and approaches and laws and policies and so on. Um, by and large, however, there were unifying themes with the first book. Um, Journalistically, it is very difficult for some women on multiple levels to be a journalist, and often that starts at home. Where there is sort of resistance to the idea of embarking on in a career in reporting from one's family, whether that's a husband or a parent or even a child, because of the many risks involved with being a female journalist. Again, depending on the country, but that was a unifying theme, particularly in some of the more conservative countries or countries where there is more of a concerted effort to silence journalists. So it starts there, and then it can extend to the street. For example, if a woman is reporting in public, she may face different types of harassments or threats or risks on her life, again, depending on where she is. And then it extends to the workplace, where she may face, unfair treatment, misogyny, again, harassment. A lot of this is not necessarily unique, of course, to the Arab world. It's just being a journalist, but I think in some ways it's accentuated or heightened in particular countries in the region. And then, of course, you get to the state level and non-state actors, where there may be attempts to suppress, and that could come in the form of detention. It could come in the form of threatening a person, and their family. It could come in the form of being targeted, being shot at, being murdered, again, depending on the country and the context. But of course, as you see there, you have multiple levels spanning different areas of a journalist's personal and professional life, and they come together to make the life of a woman journalist quite difficult in certain contexts, particularly where there is active warfare or socioeconomic or geopolitical upheaval. Now, I don't like to focus too much on those difficulties in the sense that they're important, but what is also really important is how the women then navigated those difficulties to do the journalism that they do,
Hmm.
right? And that requires a lot of resourcefulness. It requires a lot of savviness. You know, you find a lot of savviness amongst these women where they are finding ways to navigate those systems where they're using their womanhood to their advantage. You know, they recognize that only women can enter certain spaces. You know, I think Zenat Hayim always comes to mind. She's a Syrian journalist who, during the Syria civil war, would cover how the war was impacting women and their fertility and their reproductive lives, and she would enter gynecological clinics, you know, in a way that, of course, men couldn't do that. Or Hibashibani, who was a Libyan journalist who was given a TV show where she was told to focus on women's issues because they thought, quote unquote, women's issues. They thought, oh, well, she can just go do the hair and the makeup and cover that kind of thing. But really, she was covering very serious issues that were facing women in Libya. And then, you know, I saw this also in Egypt with Iman Hilal, who was a photojournalist who had experienced sexual harassment and then decided, you know what, I'm going to raise awareness about
Hmm.
this through my work. So then she used her camera as a tool to sort of document instances of sexual harassment. And these are just three examples of many in which sort of the women were navigating these very difficult reporting situations with a great deal of savviness.
Those are some great stories. Sai, any comment on that one? Or moving on?
Um, yeah, I really liked how these stories also highlighted the like the savviness and the intelligence that goes behind um, woman, the way women will find the way to, you know, show their work and do their job without, even though like kind of everything is pitted against them in, especially in those in the Middle Eastern regions. Um, what I also wanted to know about was, because we were talking about journalists, is there a, did you ever notice like a difference in journalistic styles or like approach between female journalists and male journalists?
It's a really good question. I think that because, as I said, women have access to certain spaces,
Hmm.
or maybe they're, you know, if they want to write about women's stories and interview women about their grief or their losses or how they're contending with living in a war zone or a genocide or so on, that of course the story, the way that it's going to be told, might be told differently because of the intimacy that is involved
Hmm.
with being a woman from that community who is entering that space. You know, so I think that that is certainly something that comes across. I don't want to be too prescriptive because, you know, I think men can also, of course, report with sensitivity, but I think sometimes it is to do with the cultural norms whereby a woman will feel much more comfortable speaking to another woman about some of the issues that she or her family or her children may be facing as a mother or as a wife and so on. So I think that that definitely comes through, even in my own experience. I've seen it too. I've experienced it the way that women have trusted me or spoken to me. I feel is unique and different than how they might speak, not just to a man, but to, like, let's say, a Western woman.
Mm.
Hmm.
You know, a woman who is not from that community and doesn't know the language or understand the linguistic nuances and so on,
Yeah.
or even the historical or local nuances. So I think that that certainly there are differences. Yes.
And if we wanted to now take the magnifying glass and like zoom out, um, what is the global media's perspective on Arab journalists?
I think For a long time, I mean, Edward Said wrote about this, and it was called Neo-Orientalism, which is kind of like the modern form of Orientalism. I think, of course, there has for a long time there had been kind of a preference to report on the region through the lens of a Western reporter.
Hmm.
This this has been endemic. It's not surprising. However, I think that in the past 10 or so years, there has been a change. Generally, there's an understanding that really to get to the heart of the story, you do need to have people who fully understand the region and its people, linguistically and politically and historically. And often you will have Arab journalists who kind of have a foot in the Western world and a foot in the Arab world who are able to do that and to do it quite well. To be honest, they do often have sort of a Western exposure or connections in the West that allow them to navigate those two spaces. But I do think that Arabs living in the West are, living in the diaspora. It's just part of the story of the Arab world because there's so much exile. So I think that that's normal, and I think the fact that people have been able to use their Arabness or their identity to their advantage professionally has been really beneficial in terms of crafting or reshaping the narrative on the region. However, I do think that those roles, the reporting roles, even though you do see more and more Arabs in those roles, I think that they're limiting in the sense that you won't see editors, you won't see sort of the more senior editors or managing editors
Hmm.
come from that background, right? So usually these reporters are edited, and it's sort of more limiting for them. I do think we're seeing some changes there. We've seen some high profile Arabs take on these more senior positions. However, there's much more work that needs to be done. And again, this isn't just limited to Arabs. I think minority communities also see the same. Again, I also want to say that there's a lot of reliance on so-called fixers or local journalists who do a
Yeah.
lot of the work on the ground for Western journalists, and they're often not credited or
Mm.
they're not treated equally. And that's a whole other problem, because it points to the structural issues. There's also a point of sort of bias, quote unquote bias, where Arabs are sort of not trusted to tell their own stories because they might be tainted by their identity or their background. And I've been trying to say constantly that actually the identity and background viewed as positives and should be viewed. You should trust the person, not distrust them,
Yeah.
and not have to ask them, "Hey, do you condemn Hamas kind of thing every time you speak about Palestine, which happens a lot, constantly, actually, all the time. And again, this points to deeper structural issues. And like I said, I even think that there's a lot of people that, for example, they give awards to Arab journalists, and they're like, look, we're recognizing them,
Hmm.
and so on. And again, that's positive, good, but those deeper structural issues persist. They're still there. So, in short, I would say while there has been improvement, there's still work that needs to be done. That's my feeling.
So what
No
what
doubt.
do you think would be the following steps for that, that relationship between the West and the East to kind of improve so that Arab journalists can be placed in those senior positions and they can be better recognized and even trusted to share their stories and to be for people to actually believe them.
That's such a vast question. Like, I'm not sure how
So,
to to actually pinpoint an answer. I would just say that the onus is not on us. Like, it shouldn't be on us.
yeah.
Um, we, however, I think we can keep doing the work that we do. We can keep disrupting where we can and agitating where we can if we're not being heard. I do that through my work. I did that with my first book. I did it to an extent again with my second, even though the subject matter was quite different.
Hmm.
and I'm doing it with my third. I think people should use the tools that they have to continue to either report on the region or amplify the work of journalists who are reporting on the region, to be present, to ensure that we have a seat at the table, even though, again, the onus shouldn't be on us. And sometimes there are structural barriers that don't allow us to have a seat at the table. But the effort, you know, to sort of be present, um, I would hope that people don't lose their willingness to try at least,
Mhm.
because it's not going to come to us. Unfortunately, we do have to keep on doing the work and showing up, because nobody's gonna come to us, and say, "Hey, here's this great job, you should have it." It's more like we have to be out there doing the work and showing that we can do it, and showing that we care, and showing that we're not going to be silenced, despite the efforts to silence us.
Yes, those are those are great wise words to be shared, Zahra. Ali?
What's the difference between writing an article and writing a book? I know there's obviously a huge difference in research and time spent, but when you wrote the eyeliner book, what made you like decide to go for a book format? And I know it's a lot of information, there's a lot of history, but you also write articles as well. So I'm curious as to what made you love this topic so much that you're like, you know what, I'm going to spend years working on this.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I do think, there's some good articles actually out there already about eyeliner and the history of eyeliner. And I just felt like there was so much more that could be explored. And also with a book, you are also really drawing attention to like a broader point or theme, or like deeper, more layered study of something to deliver that point, or those themes to the world. So having the space to really do that and to explore the different cultures, this was a huge honor and a privilege for me, because so often Arabs are kind of expected, if they are going to be writers and they are going to have the mic and they are going to have that space in a major publication, that they're going to end up writing about the Arab
Hmm.
world, even though, again, I do want to point to the to the distrust, but still, like, there's a component of pigeonholing, like, oh, that's going to be what they're going to do, and that's going to be what they're going to want to do. Whereas my editors trusted me with this book to kind of explore something a little bit
Hmm.
broader, because of course it's not just about the Arab world, or I mean, the origin of kahal and eyeliner is in ancient Egypt, and of course it's used in the Arab world, and the Middle East. But I went to other places. I traveled to Chad in Africa. I traveled to China. I traveled to India. I wrote about the drag queens of New York. I wrote about the Mexican American community in Los Angeles. This for me was a broadening out, and much more challenging, to report on, because I was testing myself, right? I constantly talk about, well, the Arab world should be written about sensitively. We should amplify local voices.
Mhm.
We should trust local voices. And then here I was, an Arab traveling to other countries that I'm not deeply familiar with, that I had to do the research on and report sensitively on, and to really, again, like, apply all those things that I'm preaching into my own work, right? And that was a real honor for me to have been trusted, not just by my editors and by the publisher, but really more so by the communities
Hmm.
themselves, where they welcomed me into those communities and they really trusted me to tell their stories. And I worked with researchers and translators and so on, who were again extremely trusting of me. So that was, I would say, it was far more rigorous a process, because I wasn't just sort of reporting, and giving the sights and the sounds and the smells of what I was experiencing where I was traveling to. I was also researching,
Mhm.
and the research, it wasn't just bookish research. It wasn't just reading books and articles. It was also listening to music and watching movies and looking at magazine archives. And, of course, because it's a very visual subject, eyeliner, and looking at ancient historical texts as well. So it was much more layered, I would say, of a process than an article
Hmm.
would allow for. I mean, by sheer word count, you're already suddenly like, wow. I also wanted, the article, sorry, I wanted the book to read like very it was very character
Hmm.
driven, you know, that each chapter had a
Yeah.
character that you're kind of really getting to know, or sort of a group of characters within a particular space. Because I wanted the intimacy to be there, and I felt like because I was able to devote so many pages to these characters, that some of them really came to life, and that's what I wanted. You know, that's what I would want when I read a microhistory, is that I'm not reading just sort of a very dry account of the history of this object across centuries, but I'm reading about the communities and the cultures and the characters, the cast of characters
Hmm.
of people who've been impacted by that subject, so or
Hmm.
by that object. So that's what eyeliner was for me. It allowed me, it was kind of like this little portal into all of these other worlds, and I was allowed to enter incredibly intimate spaces. And again, like I feel very fulfilled by the work that I did on eyeliner, because I experienced so much in such diverse contexts and you know circumstances and cultures and communities, and that was very illuminating for me, and like nothing I'd done before. It definitely stretched my mind, stretched my brain.
Yeah. And I remember you also mentioned in the beginning of the podcast that there's politics behind eyeliner and the history of eyeliner. So I don't know if you can briefly go over that or share anything.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I mean, well, to begin with, in ancient Egypt, you know, eyeliner was not just used for beautification. It was used to honor the gods, to channel one's spirituality. It
Hmm.
was used for practical purposes to guard against the glare of the sun, to treat eye ailments medicinally, and also to guard against the evil eye. So there was also this idea that if you belonged to nobility, if you were a pharaoh or a queen or so on, that you would have a very high quality eyeliner
Hmm.
that was produced from the highest quality materials, and your pots would also be very elaborate, and it sort of lent this idea of being regal when you wore eyeliner because you were part of the nobility. And Nefertiti, Queen Nefertiti, is the main character who I studied for ancient Egypt. That really contextualizes this idea of eyeliner, firstly, being far more than meets the eye, being far more than a cosmetic that is used for beautification. So it really starts there, and it's kind of tied to this idea of rebirth as well, where ancient Egyptians were buried with coal pots, and that really signified how important coal was for the afterlife, right? When it comes to this idea of rebirth in the afterlife, so that was really important. And then you see that in other cultures around the world, it is also used in this very layered way. And in terms of, you know, the politics of it, I think in particular that came up for me with the Mexican American community, the
Hmm.
Chola
Hmm.
community here in America, where eyeliner is worn as sort of a way to celebrate one's identity and one's heritage, but the aesthetic was extremely vivid and unique, and it was clear what the Chola aesthetic was, and that the context of that, the history of that, is that as the aesthetic of the Mexican American community was a tool for them to reject this notion of forced assimilation, like reduce your brownness to assimilate into this Anglo American culture, right? Whereas the
Yeah.
that was precisely the opposite for them, where they were saying, actually, no, we're Mexican, we're proud to be Mexican, this is our aesthetic. And of course, there are different subcultures that came along as well, but that's inherently political, you know, when you are using this object and saying, this is who I am, this is my identity. Blanket statement of like eyeliner being political in Iran. However, because women's bodies were policed, you know, in 1979, the
Yeah.
aftermath of 1979, and women had to present a specific way aesthetically, and not doing that could really cost them their freedom. That could, or you know, sometimes their life, that could be looked at as a form of rebellion, where like a woman is actually using specific tools to enhance her look because her aesthetic is deeply scrutinized, you know, but she may wear lipstick, or she may wear
Hmm.
eyeliner, or she may wear nail polish, she may, you know, have specific colors in the way she dresses. It's a little bit different today contextually,
Hmm.
but that has historically been the case, where the way a woman presents herself could be a form of rebellion. And in the aftermath of Mahsa Amini's killing, that also threw light again on how a woman's body is policed and how the choices that she makes with her aesthetic could really be a form of expressing herself, regardless of all of the restrictions that are placed upon her. So that's another context that I found to be quite interesting. It's complicated a little bit by this idea of religiosity, because actually the Prophet Muhammad was said to have worn a form of eyeliner to protect his eyes,
Yeah.
to treat them medicinally. So therefore, in some Islamic communities, it's considered completely halal and permissible to wear eyeliner. However, the distinction is that you shouldn't be wearing it to attract the opposite sex, and certainly it wouldn't be like a cat eye, like the one that I have on my
Hmm.
lid right now, right? It would just be a very subtle
Hmm.
line on along the waterline.
Yeah.
So again, there's a lot of nuances there, and I explore these nuances in the book.
Okay.
Excellent.
Ali.
Just go check out the book. It's excellent. There's a lot more details about everything in there. So that's all I have to say. Saeed, what did we learn today on today's episode?
Learned quite a lot about Palestinian journalism and not using the term resilience for Arabs in the Middle East. We learned we learned
We've banned it.
that
We've banned the word
we ban it.
resilience.
We don't want to be resilient. We just want to have normal lives. No longer held at such crazy standards. Um, but yeah, we learned a lot from you, Zahra. And your work is phenomenal. Like, please don't stop. And hopefully, a lot of people watch.
Thank you.
All the people who are watching this are motivated to also, you know, follow on the same track and continue sharing their stories and amplifying other people's stories. Um,
Thank
is there any final words you'd like to say before we end this podcast?
No, it's just for people to keep speaking up and to keep showing up, and I really hope that people are inspired to not just sort of read my works, but to actually amplify the works of the people who I try to amplify
Hmm.
amplify in my curation of the first book, and hopefully the third as well.
Awesome.
Can't wait for it.
Exactly. 2027. We're all waiting for it. Uh,
Yes, inshallah.
thank you guys for watching another episode of A to the show. This has been us.